coming up.
So we have an Indigenous woman that was kicked out for telling the truth. We have one that is misleading and has a cloudy past. How come he still remains in caucus and Jody Wilson-Raybould was shown the exit?
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Relevance.
Well, on the same point of order, let the record show that Member Carr couldn't even keep a straight face while he was saying that. And I was struck by your comment that the Randy Boissonneau case is complex. I don't think it's complex at all. I think it's very simple. What do you think is complex on these identity issues about Randy Boissonneau's previous claims around Indigenous identity? What's complex there?
It's got to make you uncomfortable that Randy Boissonneau is still in caucus. You're the one managing the relationships.
Point of order, Mr.
That there's 93 educational assistants that have been issued layoff notices and will be unable to provide necessary service to Indigenous children that better equips them.
Asked and answered.
Sorry, Mr. Batiste, point of order.
But how do you explain the fact that Global Health Imports, Randy Boissonneau's company, does not appear to have been referred to the RCMP, that Canadian Healthcare Agency is still able to bid on government contracts, that you have 1,100 businesses removed, but nothing referred to the RCMP, nobody thus far barred from accessing government contracts? Doesn't this suggest that Indigenous identity fraud just isn't being taken seriously?
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Minister Anasangari, is it appropriate Randy Boissonneau remain in the Liberal caucus?
Thank you, Mr. Schmale. As you know, each caucus is the master of its own domain, and I will leave that up to the Liberal caucus to decide.
Do you think it's appropriate he remain in there?
I believe he has taken the right steps to reflect on what's happened, and he is trying to defend his name. So I do believe that he is doing the right thing at the moment.
Okay, Minister Petitpas-Taylor, same question.
Thank you so much for that question, and always good to see you, MP Schmale. To elaborate a bit on what my friend and colleague has indicated, I believe that Randy Boissonneau contributes tremendously to our caucus. He contributes tremendously to what is happening in Western Canada. And again, he has appeared at committee last week and answered a number of questions.
Okay.
And again, I've appreciated serving with him as a member of Parliament in the class of 2015 and also in Cabinet in 2021.
Committing Indigenous identity fraud is wrong? Sure. Yeah, I'll start with you and then go back to Minister Anasangari.
Intentionally misleading Canadians is wrong.
Same question?
Yes.
Do you think it's harmful as well?
Yes.
Okay. Same question, Mr. Minister. Okay, for the record, that was a nod. What do you think? I don't know who to start with now. Minister Anasangari. Do you think the impact of Randy Boissonneau's actions has caused hurt and harm within Indigenous communities?
I think that it's fair to say that there have been a number of Indigenous leaders who have spoken out. And for his part, Mr. Boissonneau has taken responsibility and has apologized. I think the issue of Indigenous identity, and in particularly his case, he is an adoptee, from what I understand, is quite complex. And I believe he's taken the right steps. This is certainly not something that I think anyone should take lightly. He is taking the right measures to ensure that he both ensures healing for those who he may have impacted in a negative way, but at the same time ensures that he is able to clear his name and rebuild the trust that is required in the work that we do.
J'oserais dire exactement la même chose que mon...
I was about the same thing as my friend. I believe that Minister Boissonneau, or rather Member Boissonneau, did the right thing, that he appeared before the committee last week. He spent 2 hours asking detailed questions put to him by the committee. Now he's taking the time to reset the clock to once again be able to rectify the situation.
So if we have, and we did have, an Indigenous woman inside the Liberal caucus, Jody Wilson-Raybould. She was kicked out of caucus for telling the truth. Now we have a non-Indigenous man who misled on a number of issues, being part of co-owning a company while still being in caucus, and the list goes on. You heard the testimony, you referenced it. So we have an Indigenous woman that was kicked out for telling the truth. We have one that is misleading and has a past. How come he still remains in caucus and Jody Wilson-Raybould was shown the exit?
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
So we have a point of order, Mr. Carr.
Relevance?
Well, on the same point of order, let the record show that Member Carr couldn't even keep a straight face while he was saying that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carr. As always, I just want to remind members to keep comments relevant to the study at hand. And so I pause it for Mr. Schmale. You have 2 minutes and 9 seconds left.
Well, I trust how you keep time, Chair, so thank you very much. To the question, to the ministers.
I just want to repeat what I said earlier. Mr. Bosno has acknowledged the errors that took place. He's talked about his personal identity, the complexity that...
I think there should be an extra step here. Why is he still in caucus? If Jody Wilson-Raybould was shown the exit.
Now, Mr. Chair, I have a legitimate point of order here.
Oh.
This is no, just
Jaw-dropping breaking news. A legitimate point of order.
Colleagues, we have a point of order, Mr. Carr.
I had to specify it was legitimate in order to ensure that my colleagues across the way were aware. We are still on the same motion we were on last time. Could Mr. Schmale or you perhaps provide some direction on how whether or not a member belongs to a particular political party's caucus is relevant to Indigenous procurement? It's completely legitimate and fair for the member to ask questions about Mr. Boissonneau as it pertains to Indigenous procurement. No one's interrupting him when he chooses to do that. However, asking the ministers to comment on the membership of their political party's caucus and how that pertains to a member is not in any way that I can see relevant to the motion that we've been sent here to discuss. Perhaps you can speak to that, or Mr. Schmale can provide some further explanation.
So I'll just say one thing. So we are doing a study or an update to the barriers to Indigenous economic development. The order that we were given to the committee was that recommitted for the committee for further consideration with a view of studying the economic and anti-reconciliatory barriers posed by fraudulent bids and applications for procurement opportunities set aside for Indigenous businesses, including those from non-Indigenous owned companies. So just want to remind members of that and as much as possible to keep your questions and comments relevant to the study that's at hand. But with that, Mr. Schmale, you have a little bit more than a minute and a half to go.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to that question in a second here. Minister Petitpas-Taylor, this is not the first time you've took over a ministry from Randy Boissonneau. Do you feel uncomfortable doing so this time under the current circumstances?
I don't understand the premise of your question.
Well, that goes to my previous question about Jody Wilson-Raybould being removed from caucus, but Randy Boissonneau still remaining in caucus. I think this raises some pretty significant concerns. The fact that, again, he co-owned a company, was still bidding on contract. They checked a box claiming Indigenous ownership, trying to access Indigenous contracts set aside specifically for Indigenous-owned business. We just have 1,100 companies that were removed from the registry. So now you're coming into a role, not the first time you've taken over for a ministry for Minister Boissonneau. Under these circumstances, this cloud that surrounds Minister Boissonneau, it can't be overly comfortable walking into that office now.
Well, first and foremost, I think that's the question that you'd have to ask MP Boissonneau with respect to his dealings. I am feeling comfortable getting briefed up on a new file that I've just taken over in the past 2 weeks. And again, my officials have been very helpful in helping me get up to date on the files.
My previous question about Jody Wilson-Raybould, she was removed, Randy Boissonneau stays. How do we...
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Point of order, Mr. Carr.
Can you provide some direction to the committee, please, on the relevance and the connection between a former member of Parliament, their membership within the Liberal caucus, and the motion that we were sent here to discuss as it pertains to Indigenous procurement?
Answer that question. The barriers to economic barriers to economic development in Indigenous communities. I'm speaking to this because Randy Boissonneau co-owned a company that claimed Indigenous status when in fact they were not. That, to me, is a barrier to economic development. So let's talk about it.
Not the membership in caucus.
So let's talk about it.
So,
Stay on track.
Very quickly, final question, and your time is just about up.
Okay, that was my question. Why?
That's a question that you'd have to refer to MP Boissonneau, and I think he was here last week for 2 hours to answer many of your questions.
Minister Hernandez-Sangre, it's good to see you here. You made a couple statements about Indigenous identity in your opening. You said that indigeneity is personal and complex. You also said that Indigenous identity is defined by the communities themselves. I would just observe that these statements are somewhat contradictory. Either indigeneity is personal, that is, it's up to the individual to define whether or not they're Indigenous, or it is defined by the community. And if it's defined by the community, then an individual ought not just say, I'm Indigenous on their own. But if it's personal and complex, then that opens up more space for self-identification on varying grounds. So I wonder if you can reconcile that contradiction and tell us, do you think Indigenous identity is more defined by the individual who decides how they want to identify, or if it's more defined by the community that says, yes or no, this person is Indigenous?
Thank you, Mr. Genius, and good to see you again, and good to be in a committee room with you. I don't think they're mutually incompatible. In a sense of collective identity, when we talk about collectivities, I do believe communities should be defining what that collectivity looks like and is, and the historical formation of that collectivity over generations and in some cases millennia. The distinction sometimes does come to the individual. So, for example, if you speak to Mohawks in Ontario, they will fiercely say the issues around identity is strictly up to the individual nation to define what citizenship looks like. It is not up to the federal government in this case to be. So they're saying that it's up to the nation, right? If I may just finish, because I think you asked a very critical question.
Just briefly, though, please.
And I do want to give you a wholesome answer, okay? So I do think in that case it is that collectivity that defines who their citizens are. That's the way it should be.
Okay.
With respect to the individual, in a situation, if you look at the history of issues around residential schools, on child welfare systems, where someone's identity has, for many reasons, for myriad of reasons, been compounded by the fact that they may not be living with their biological parents, or living in a community where they would have been born and they have long lineage, or they can trace long lineage. I do think it's legitimate for an individual to be contemplating and to understand what that identity looks like.
Okay, I have limited time, so I think I understand where you're going with this, but in those cases, you've got an individual that's seeking information about their own history, their heritage that they've been separated from. It's still the community that defines that identity. It's just that an individual has been separated from that community. This question is at the heart of a lot of this issue, because you have now a lot of people popping up trying to take advantage of government programs who don't have connections to any kind of community. And I was struck by your comment that the Randy Boissonneau case is complex. I don't think it's complex at all. I think it's very simple. What do you think is complex on these identity issues about Randy Boissonneau's previous claims around Indigenous identity? What's complex there?
Well, to me, first and foremost, one of the things that I've contemplated on this issue is that he was adopted. So he was not from his biological family unit. Can
I just say on that, just quickly though, he claimed to be a non-status adopted Cree, and Ms. Idlout asked him what Cree nation, and he couldn't answer that question. His family's not Cree, his family is Métis, and the rules around membership in the Métis community are very clear and they don't apply to him. So it's not actually complex. I mean, he has. I just don't. Why do you think it's complex?
Sorry, Mr. Genuis, there's a point of order. Mr. Batiste?
I think that Mr. Genuis's comment there that says the Métis is very clear is an inaccurate assessment.
That's obviously not a point of order. Use your own round if you think what I say is inaccurate. Come on. You know the rules.
If he says it's simple, it's offensive to Indigenous people around Canada that he would think this is that indigeneity is a complex thing. In his very question, he talks about.
Can we just get past the feigned outrage? The Métis Nation of Alberta has a clear sense of who they are.
There's too much
on the same point of order.
Crosstalk happening here. So, Mr. Batiste, this is not a point of order. I do want to give the floor back to Mr. Genuis. You have about 45 seconds.
I would just ask him to be respectful of his language towards Indigenous people.
Yeah.
And their criteria for defining themselves.
Okay, can I just speak on the same point of order, Mr. Chair? The Métis Nation of Alberta know who they are, and they have been clear about who they are, and they have been clear that they get to decide, and that Randy Boissonneau is not Indigenous.
So, look, there's a lot of.
Tell me.
We're going to hear from them very soon. It doesn't apply to Randy Boissonneau.
So do you know?
It's not complex. It doesn't apply to
Mr. Batiste. Mr. Batiste, right now, Mr. Genuis has the floor. He has about 45 seconds left. There will be
respectful.
I agree. All members need to be respectful. I know this is a very, very charged subject, and there will be another round for questions from the Liberal Party and comments. But I do want to give the floor back to Mr. Genuis for about 40 seconds.
Yeah, just to really drill down on this, Mr. Anasengri, and then I'll give you the floor to wrap up. But Mr. Boissonneau said he was non-status adopted Cree. He claimed to come up with that term in conversation with an Indigenous researcher. The Indigenous researcher said no, he didn't give him that term. And you and Mr. Batiste and others want to say that this is complex. He's a member of your caucus and he just lied about who he was for political advantage. I don't think it's complex at all. Why? Do you maintain that it's complex? And if so, why is it complex?
Mr. Genuis, there's a point of order. Mr. Hanley.
Again, please respect for the member, and the accusation of lying, I think, is inappropriate.
It's not against the rules to tell the truth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hanley.
Let's answer the question.
Do you want to remind all members to be respectful? I know Standing Order 18 speaks specifically to that. With that, time is very short. If Mr. Genuis could get to his question, and then we'll moving on to the next speaker.
Yeah, I mean, I've tried to ask it a few times. Love to hear from Minister Anasengri again. Why is it complex? It's not complex, it's simple. But why do you think it's complex? In the case of Mr. Boissonneau specifically.
Mr. Genuis, I believe I've answered that question. We can agree to disagree on this. It is not that straightforward for someone who was adopted into a family. The issue of identity is complex to start off with, but in this particular case, I think it's compounded by the fact that he was adopted. I think he's spoken for himself. I'm not here to add to that. I think he's given you his position. As far as I'm concerned, if you disagree with my analysis of this, we can agree to disagree.
I want to pick up on somewhat where we left off when we talked about earlier that claiming Indigenous identity and it being fraudulent is wrong and harmful. I think we all agreed on that. So how does the government recover from the damage done within Indigenous communities after that?
Mr. Schmale, I think the work, first of all, let me just speak about what Randy needs to do and what he's committed to doing. From what my understanding is that he is acknowledged and apologized for the errors, and he is also committed to meeting with Indigenous people and leaders in order to ensure that he's able to rebuild trust. I think it's a personal responsibility he's taken. From a government perspective, I want to just talk about, I think there are a number of issues that have come up, both, I think from a process perspective, but ultimately about how the government put in a directory that is not self-determined by Indigenous people, and I believe that is the starting point for this conversation. And then I think we need to do greater work around the review, how what's constituted, what the partnership looks like, because it is ultimately Indigenous people that need to determine who are Indigenous businesses and who should be qualifying for procurement. So I believe that is the path that we need to take, and it can't happen overnight. But in the meantime, we need to have some significant safeguards to ensure that Indigenous identity concerns are addressed immediately while we develop a longer-term system.
So, given the fact that 1,100 fake Indigenous businesses were removed from the registry, we have the Shannon Matabawaban from the NACA organization, the executive director, saying upwards of 70% of the listed businesses on that directory are not Indigenous owned. What other concrete steps has been taken to ensure this registry actually is true?
I believe Minister Haidu has answered those questions. It is very much in her purview, but I will just add that the actual thinking around Indigenous procurement and ensuring that there's 5% Indigenous procurement, I think it's absolutely necessary. I think how we get there is where I think we need to do better, and in ensuring especially that those who are eligible for contracts are in fact do qualify under the current procurement mandates that exist. If we need to tighten those mandates, if we need to improve, if that 51% need to come to 60 or 65%, maybe that's a conversation that we need to have, but we need to have it in conjunction with Indigenous people, and I believe the government is very committed. We're very committed to moving forward to ensure that we do far better on this issue, with the absolute determination that we need to increase procurement towards Indigenous businesses.
Yeah, the registry still is not solid. We have one Indigenous organization after another saying it isn't solid, and given the fact that your portfolio to large extent is in the name, right? Crown Indigenous Relations. You're the one sent in to, aside from negotiating and other things, but to make sure that relationship remains solid and strong. It's got to make you uncomfortable that Randy Boissonneau's still in caucus. You're the one managing the relationships.
Point of order, Mr.
We have a point of order, Mr. Carr.
Just coming back to this piece of relevance around caucus, I don't believe I saw that anywhere in the House instruction on the motion, but if we are going to go there, perhaps we can talk about why Karen Vecchio's not the chair of Status of Women anymore. Arnold Viersen was removed from this particular committee.
Now we're going this is a bit...
Mr. O'Toole was removed from their caucus. Maybe we can start to talk about why that is.
Mr. Carr, I think you've made your point about the relevance here, and are getting off of the relevance as well. At the same point, I do again want to remind members the study at hand on barriers to Indigenous economic development and the order which is on the procurement side and the anti-reconciliatory impacts of non-Indigenous businesses as well. But with that, I will hand the floor back over to Mr. Smale for about 45 seconds.
Chair, just a point of order quickly before we reach on the same point of order, because this keeps coming up and it might be uncomfortable for Mr. Carr's liberal caucus. We're talking about a case of Indigenous identity fraud. We're talking to the minister who's responsible for the government's efforts on reconciliation, and it obviously impacts those reconciliation efforts when you have a member of the Liberal caucus who engaged in Indigenous identity fraud, and his company falsely represented themselves as Indigenous in order to try to get government contracts, and he remains in the Liberal caucus. That's very different from questions about
debate, Mr.
committee assignments, et cetera. I mean, I'm happy not to talk about it if you didn't bring it up, Mr. Carr, and I know this is an uncomfortable subject for you, and you probably have feelings about Mr. Boissonneau's Indigenous identity fraud as well.
But we're getting into a debate here, and let's get back to the matter at hand. Mr. Schmale, the floor is yours. We have about 45 seconds.
Okay, I pose the question to the minister. It says, as the minister responsible for Crown Indigenous Relations, are you comfortable with Randy Boissonneau still being in caucus?
Well, I believe Mr. Boissonneau is taking the right steps in order to, I think, work with people that he knows and to gain the trust of Indigenous people. I will leave it to him to clear his name. I think he has been at committee before and he has answered the questions and concerns posed to him.
Do you have trust in the Indigenous procurement program, the way it's set up now?
I believe it needs to be better.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our ministers for attending committee. Minister Anna Nsangiri, are you familiar with Jordan's principle?
Yes, I am.
And do you support Jordan's principle?
Yes, I do.
And Jordan's principle clearly says that all First Nations children living in Canada will receive the products, services, and support that they need when they need them. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Correct.
So, Mr. Fogg, if I may just interject, this area is very much the purview of Minister Haidu, so I will have limited ability to answer questions relating to this particular issue.
Yeah, I think you should still be, it's still all under Indigenous Services, and I think you should be able to answer it.
So my role is that of Minister of Crown and Indigenous Relations, so I do think that this is best directed to Minister Haidu.
Correct. So I'm just wondering, when a person of non-Indigenous status receives money intended for Indigenous peoples, do you really think that, like Randy Boissonneau's company, do you really think that's fair when the Hanover School Division in my riding has had to issue 93 layoff notices to Jordan's principal educational assistants because their funding was yanked by your department? Is that fair?
Mr. Fogg, it's not my department, and I will not be able to answer this question.
Well, Indigenous Service Canada had indicated to the Hanover School Division in May that and I'll quote you, it says, I can 100% confirm that if a school division is renewing an EA request for a student who had an EA approved in the same division 23-24, they can inform the EAA that they will be rehired for the 24-25 school year. The invoice that the school division submitted to your department for September was rejected on October 31st. Is that fair that money that...
And with great respect to you, Mr. Fogg, Mr. Chair, I'm unable to answer questions that are outside of my portfolio, and I am not, for the record, the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada. I am the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations. So this is a matter that, and as in your own words, sir, directly involves Indigenous Services Canada, and I would encourage you, and I'm sure Minister Haidu would be more than glad to answer those questions, that you direct those questions to her.
Well, I'm wondering if you think it's fair.
I'm not, I will not be able to come to a conclusion on a matter that I have limited knowledge on.
Okay, so what you're saying is it's not of a great enough concern for you that there's 93 educational assistants that have been issued layoff notices and will be unable to provide necessary service to Indigenous children that better equips them.
Asked and answered.
Sorry, Mr. Batiste, point of order.
Yes, asked and answered. Repetition. He's asking the same question on a file that he knows is not under the minister's gambit. He can't take all Indigenous things in Canada and put them under just one minister. That's what the Conservatives did.
Just on the same point of order, can you shut him down when he's obviously not
thank you very much,
standing
Mr.
orders?
Batiste.
Sorry,
I
enforce the little bit of knowledge about Indigenous.
Mr. Batiste.
That unhelpful to their simple narratives. but there's a lot more.
It's not a
Mr.
matter
Batiste,
of order.
This is not a point of
It's
order. I want to get back to the matter at hand here. And the minister, it seems to me the minister is answering the best that he can. We did have Minister Haiju here earlier this evening to speak to this issue. The member does have about a minute 45 left in his time, and I'll start the clock so you can continue with your questioning.
Well, Minister Anasangri, you did indicate you work closely with Minister Haiju. And so this is something that you could carry forward. As to, the department says that urgent issues, when it comes to issues of Jordan's principle, will be addressed within 48 hours. This is an urgent issue, sir. It also says that non-urgent issues will be addressed within a week. This is an urgent issue, sir. This needs to be addressed. There are Indigenous children that need the support that is provided by an educational assistant and are currently not going to be able to get that support. Will you commit to carrying that forward to Minister Haiju?
Mr. Falk, I will be more than glad to convey your concerns to Ms. Haiju. I also want to encourage you. I have not had a single question from the Conservative Party since my appointment on my portfolio. So I encourage you, if you do want to ask a question to Ms. Haiju, I don't believe you've asked a question to her either. At question period, you're more than welcome to also hold our government to account through that means as well.
Been all these Liberal points of orders when the minister was here, I perhaps would have had a round to be able to ask her that question, but your Liberal colleagues have prevented me from doing that. I'm good.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Falk.
Thank you, Chair. I want to talk a bit about the issue of Indigenous identity fraud. Indigenous identity fraud is an act of anti-reconciliation. It shouldn't happen. Minister Anasangri, you're the minister responsible for reconciliation, so this should be a particular concern to you. Indigenous leaders have said that Indigenous identity fraud is rampant. The AFN has said that substantially more than half of those benefiting from the Indigenous procurement program are actually shell companies. And you alluded a bit to the Indigenous identity fraud issue in your opening comments. The problem is that not a single company has faced consequences for Indigenous identity fraud. There have been zero consequences meted out for an Indigenous identity fraud, despite the fact that Indigenous leaders across the board are saying this is rampant. Do you think it's acceptable that nobody has faced consequences for Indigenous identity fraud?
No.
Okay. So why has nobody faced consequences, and what do you think should be done to change that?
Well, I believe there is a undertaking by Minister Haiju to investigate this matter and to ensure that there is compliance. If there isn't compliance, or if there are those who have lied and who have misled in seeking procurement opportunities, then I think there should be consequences. I'm not the one to determine what that is, but I do think there should be consequences. And I understand
the difference in role here. But you said in your opening comments, and I'll quote you, you said, "We have reports of this strategy being taken advantage of. This is why Indigenous Services Canada is mandated to verify eligibility of businesses receiving contracts under the procurement strategy for Indigenous businesses. These audits led to over 1,100 businesses being removed from the Indigenous Business Directory." So it does seem that you are able to identify businesses that should be removed from the Indigenous Business Directory. And you have companies like the Canadian Healthcare Agency that have been removed from the Indigenous Business Directory. The problem is that once they're removed, there's no further consequences, and they're actually able to bid on other government contracts. So it doesn't seem like you're having trouble identifying the instances where this has happened. The government is simply just choosing not to impose any consequences on them. Case in point, Canadian Healthcare Agency, they're still getting government contracts. They've been taken off the Indigenous business, but they're still getting government contracts. Is that acceptable?
Well, there are three issues here, right? So first is the actual directory itself. So if the directory, is if the individual companies are deemed to be ineligible, first they should be removed from the directory. Secondly, if they did obtain contracts as a result of falsification, then I think there should be consequences in terms of, because it is technically it is a criminal act to lie on a form of that nature, and there should be consequences for those who may have received contract under false pretenses. And thirdly, of course, there should be a bar on those companies from receiving additional contracts from the government for a period of time. We can disagree on what justice looks like. For me, progressive penalties is what I believe in.
I appreciate I'll just jump in because of time. I appreciate your answer insofar as you've actually gone further than other ministers. Minister Duclos, for example, was willing to go in acknowledging that, yes, Indigenous identity fraud is fraud. It's criminal, and where possible, there should be criminal consequences, and certainly people shouldn't be barred from getting contracts. But how do you explain the fact that Global Health Imports, Randy Boissonneau's company, does not appear to have been referred to the RCMP, that Canadian Healthcare Agency is still able to bid on government contracts, that you have 1,100 businesses removed, but nothing referred to the RCMP, nobody thus far barred from accessing government contracts? Doesn't this suggest that Indigenous identity fraud just isn't being taken seriously?
Look, I believe there are measures need to be taken, and I think at the outset I said that we need to do better, and I do believe that there needs to be consequences for those who clearly misidentify themselves, whether deliberately or not, and of course, getting them off the list is the first of those consequences.
But you still think Randy Boissonneau should stay in caucus?
Further than that, I think I've already answered that question, Mr. Jennings.
Yeah, it just seems with him that you're leaning a lot into the subjectivity and complexity when he has now admitted that he's not Indigenous, and he's admitted that he misrepresented conversations he's had with an Indigenous researcher in the past. But I do appreciate that you've gone further than your ministerial colleagues, and I hope they will take up your challenge to improve on the significant failures that you've identified, that we've identified in terms of not dealing with Indigenous identity fraud effectively.
Thank you very much.